Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Though history had been written at Rome since the 3rd century BC, the earliest historical and historiographical works in Latin to have been preserved in their entirety are, aside from the Caesarean Commentarii, which are distinct from history, the two monographs of Gaius Sallustius Crispus, whose dates are roughly from 86 BC to 35 BC. Whether or not Cicero's is a fair description of the now lost histories written before the death of Caesar that we talked about in our previous lecture, sometime in the 40s BC, Sallust published two short works that were good enough to last. In the first of them, the Bellum Catilinae, Sallust narrates the career of the revolutionary Catiline during the years 64 to 62 BC. In his second work, the Bellum Jugurthinum, a work of almost twice the length of the Bellum Catilinae, Sallust explores the intertwined themes of Rome's war in North Africa against the Numidian leader Jugurtha and the concomitant political upheavals in Rome during the years 118 to 105 BC. And a third work, the Historiae, is a five-book analytic history of the period 78 to 67 BC, which was in all likelihood left unfinished at the author's death and survives only now in fragments. The personality conveyed by Sallust's prefatory remarks, both in the Bellum Catilinae and the Bellum Jugurthinum, is of a man writing history for delectation in disillusionment, as Sir Ronald Syme put it so well. In his apologia for intellectual activity inside of these prefatory remarks, Sallust claims that history writing is almost as good as political action. Indeed, in these corrupt times as that he is writing in, it is the only possible course for a moral Roman to take. Sallust's historical works, his speeches and narrative alike, bear out the truth of the dictum that rhetoric is the medium of thought about politics. His detached approach assures that both sides of the political scene are treated with the same mistrustful, more than slightly jaundiced eye. Yet his insistence in these prefaces on the utility of history and on the possibility of learning morally sound behavior from observing the past makes demands on the reader beyond simply that of listening to the voice of doom. This is a history that is meant to teach, even to inspire. As he says, for instance, in the Bellum Jugurthinum, I have often heard that Quintus Maximus, Publius Scipio, and other extremely eminent men, besides, were accustomed to say that when they looked at the imagenes, that is, the funeral portrait masks that you see in the screen here, of their ancestors, their spirit was enthusiastically fired with a desire for virtus, virtue. It is evident that the wax shape itself does not have such power in it, but because of the memory of their deeds, this flame grows in the breasts of outstanding men and does not die down before their virtus has equaled the reputation and glory of their ancestors. Sallust's chief occupation throughout his work is with this concept of virtus. And what is virtus? It is that functioning of ingenium, that is a person's inborn talent and intellectual abilities, so as to achieve egregia facinera, or outstanding deeds, and thus to win gloria by the exercise of bonae artes, or which are, of course, endeavors including, or qualities even, including energy, industria, hard work, labor, integrity, fides, modesty, pudor, and self-constraint, continentia. Sallus's conception of virtus is akin to the traditional Roman aristocratic notion, except that Sallust is a self-made quality that neither depends on nor is guaranteed by a person's birth, chosen activity, or class. Sallust explores this preoccupation of his with virtus in manifold ways, through philosophical discussion in the prefaces, through presentation of virtus corrupted or perverted, as in both the characters of Catiline and Jugurtha, or of virtus alloyed with base elements, sometimes turning a man from the proper course altogether, as in Marius, Sulla, and Pompey, and through a comparison of two great figures, each of whom embodies an aspect of virtus. This is particularly seen in his comparison between Caesar and Cato. Throughout, Sallust engages his readers' attention by emphasizing the gap between historical reality and ideal moral conduct, and by suggesting that only through understanding history, particularly the factors that have produced the present moral decline, can one learn the correct behavior that will put Rome back on the path of virtus. And he says this explicitly in the Bellum Jugurthinum 1:3. It is particularly character, observed in speech or action, that shows the dynamic quality of virtus. The fact that the narratives of the monographs are clearly, and that of the Historiae was perhaps focused throughout somewhat on ambivalent figures, shows Sallust's fascination with personalities that are compounded of both good and ill. Sallust's moderation does not extend to his style, though the loss of most pre-Sallustian prose apart from Cicero makes it difficult to evaluate his contribution to his chosen genre. It is generally assumed that the way he chose to write was groundbreaking and established a new style for the Latin historiographical language. In fact, however, as the scholar F.R.D. Goodyear has emphasized, Sallust had precedence in both form and content. Goodyear rightly pointed to the work of Cornelius Cicero, whose history of the social war and after was continued by Sallust in the Historiae, and he was a precedent and example for adventures in expression. And Goodyear also points to the monograph of Coelius Antipater and the early first-century autobiography of Rutilius Rufus, who was one of Sallus's sources for the Bellum Jugurthinum. These were precedents for the form of both the Bellum Catilinae and the Bellum Jugurthinum. It is particularly relevant that some of Sisenna's favorite expressions in Latin, ending adverbs in the letters I, am, for example, and nouns, abstract nouns ending in pudo, these are quintessentially historiographical, and they will become common in Sallust and thereafter in Livy and Tacitus. Moreover, all three of Sallust's works illustrate a combination of two of the three styles that predominate in the fragments of the earlier historians. That is the purposely simple style of Cato and Piso, the colored rhetorical language of Coelius and Sisenna, which owes much to Catonian archaism. And it may well be true then that Sallust was not in any way an obvious pioneer in the sense of style, therefore. But as I said, because we have such small amounts of these earlier writers, only fragments to deal with, it's hard to gauge that sufficiently. Now, style is an interesting thing. It has long been considered a reflection of a writer's character. Le style est l'homme même. Style is the man himself, as the Frenchman Buffon put it. Whether or not that sentiment is true, there can be such thing as a persona, which may well differ considerably from the writer's real self. Certainly, style reflects a way of seeing the world, and this is especially important to bear in mind when reading history. Again, Buffon put it, the fish that the analyst of style hopes to catch is nothing less than the historian's total perception of the past, the constraints within which he works, and the truths he is uniquely capable of grasping. And if we have learned anything since the Romantics of the 19th century, it is that style is not the dress of thought, but part of its essence. A smooth, rich, full style might mirror either a desire for political or social concord, or a concord that the author actually perceives in the events and structures forming the subject of the story. While on the other hand, a crabbed, difficult, elliptical style may reinforce a critical view of war or of the behavior of political factions, and can create a linguistic atmosphere imitating the contradictions and hypocrisies in the real world. So style reflects ideology, and the style for which Sallust became famous was Thucydidean at heart. We recall that the Greek historian Thucydides, especially in his celebrated passage in Book 3, Chapter 82 of the Stasis, or civil discord on the island of Corcyra, Thucydides took the idea that because language mirrors reality, when reality is out of joint, when there is civil strife, for instance, or when politicians chase after glory, money, or power, regardless of the cost, then language is misused, and the surface representation created by words has only a distorted, deceptive connection to the reality it purports to portray. And we talked about this in one of our lectures on Thucydides. And as a result, people's expectations are deceived as well. The world does not work the way it appears to. Though equally capable of writing sentences full of rhetorical balance, for instance, in the Bellum Jugurthinum opening sections of 1 and 2, and also section 10, when it is appropriate, Sallust shows the lack of coherence between words and reality that he is depicting in the actions of the events he's narrating. And he does so by writing in a way that similarly upends, or even we might say deceives, expectations. His rocky, unbalanced syntax uses connectives where they are not wanted and omits them when they are. He links non-parallel expressions by means of parallel correlatives. This is hard to come across in translation, but if you want to look at some of the Latin, for instance, the section of Bellum Jugurthinum 7.2 gives a good example where, for instance, he says, vel ostentando virtutem, vel hostium saevitia, where we have a combination of well plus a gerund, and then a noun, and then in the next well section, that is in the corresponding either or section, we have a genitive noun plus a nominative noun. So it lacks correspondence. It is deliberately asymmetrical. Or in other points, he will use sequences that disturb the expected parallelism. A favorite of his is what to say, pars, and then for the next section, alii. So a part of some people did something, and then others did this, as opposed to pars, pars, or alii, which would be the more typical parallelism. And these are section numbers on the screen that you could look up if you care to. He also reverses the order of common expressions, especially those familiar from use in political or state language. For instance, militiae et domi, which he talks about, the phrase he uses in Historiae 1:1, and he switches that for he uses that as opposed to the official domi militiaeque, at home and at war. He defeats expectations on the level of diction as well, reaching back to the, by this point, archaic language of Cato the Elder, or into the repertoire of high poetry for old-fashioned or elevated words, innovating by inventing new words or by extending Latin's syntactical range, for instance, the use of the future participle. Or he also shows up the cliches of contemporary oratorical and political rhetoric by putting them in a new context in which their essential emptiness is revealed. Now, the ancients remarked on this a lot. Sallust was famous in antiquity for writing structe, that is, with attention to form. This is how the rhetorical writer Fronto in the 2nd century AD describes it in his own writings. Critics have found many structures in his monographs, both simple and complex, each alternative organization offering a different way of reading the history, of perceiving the relationship between the parts of the book, a richness illustrating how carefully he did write. A structure of which he was particularly fond on both a large and small scale is antithesis, that is, the opposition of contraries. At heart, this is a rhetorical device, like the phrase I just mentioned, militiae et domi, in the military and at home. That is, at home and at war. And now this use of opposition of contraries, this use of antithesis, has been identified as the fundamental organizing principle of Sallust thought. Antithesis on the level of diction or syntax enables him to make subtle connections, often forcing the reader to work hard to tease out his meaning. On the level of thought, it structures his analysis of the opposition between body and soul, for instance, energy and inertia, good and evil. More subtly, it also informs the opposition between two kinds of good, as in the comparison of Caesar and Cato in the Bellum Catilinae that I mentioned a moment ago, or two kinds of extremism, as in the balance between the speeches of Lepidus and Philippus in the Historiae, each of which deconstructs itself through an ironic contrast between the reader's knowledge and the speaker's hollow claims. Now, to take the first of his works, the Bellum Catilinae, the first and perhaps most remarkable feature of Sallust's first work is the preface, which goes for a very long period, considering that the work itself is not very long. It goes for the first 13 full sections and comprises over a sixth of the monograph as a whole, and seems clearly to breach the convention that we read about, for instance, in Lucian, Quomodo historia conscribenda sit, that is how history should be written, namely that a preface should be proportionate to the main narrative. Starting from the premise that men should not spend their lives in silentio, silence, Sallust, in the first two chapters of the preface, argues that the mind is superior to the body, and that this superiority obtains equally in war and peace, in pace ita ut in bello. He then uses this argument to suggest that acting well on behalf of the state, bene facere rei publicae, and speaking well of the state, benedicere, are not essentially different activities. It is as legitimate, he says, to be distinguished in peace for the time of writing as in war for the time of action. And praise is often given both to men of action and to those who have written on others' acts. But praise does not accrue in equal measure. Haud quaquam par, he says in section 3.2. It does not accrue in equal measure to the writer and to the practitioner. The latter, here termed the auctor, in order to encourage still further analogy between the two roles. Yet despite this inequality, the difficulty of writing about events should not be underestimated. In primis arduum, that is, it is especially difficult. Sallust offers two reasons for the difficulty of writing history. The first, primum, is that deeds have to be matched by words. Facta dictis exaequanda sunt. Modern readers might assume that Sallust is here referring to a problem of mimesis, of imitation in writing, namely that he's referring to the difficulty of representing in the medium of narrative events which took place over the course of time or at the same time, in the same or different places, and which therefore involved movement, action, persons, causes, and results. And this fundamental problem, which faces every narrative historian in every age, might be what one thinks he is referring to. And it was something that was actually well recognized by one of Sallus's own contemporaries, the historian Diodorus Siculus, in his work, the quote for which is on the screen in front of you. And presumably other earlier writers, too, might have mentioned it, whose work hasn't survived. But Sallust seems, in fact, to be referring to a rather different problem, namely the difficulty of describing men and events in proportion to their deserts. Almost always, such phrases as facta dictis exaequare are used in the context of finding words to describe adequately great deeds or great men, although occasionally the difficulty is the converse task of describing adequately some heinous crime or a villain. Now, that this is Sallust's meaning is made even more clear by his second reason why writing is difficult, why writing history is difficult. He says that when the historian's task is completed, its reception by readers invariably provokes one of two reactions. If the author has criticized the failings of people, that is, reprehenderis delicta, he is accused of malevolence and spite. If he praises great virtue and glory, on the other hand, magna virtute atque gloria, his words are accepted with equanimity only up to the point that others can believe that they could have done the same. Okay, so they're only accepted up to a certain point, but then disbelieved thereafter. A point that actually Thucydides had made in his own work. Thus, Sallust's second reason for the difficulty of writing history is complementary to the first, but seen as as dependent upon the readers of the completed work rather than, as in the first, upon the historian engaged in the task. Now, at this point, we might expect Sallust to claim that by successfully negotiating the first of these difficulties, he has done his best to forestall the second. Such a claim will, in effect, follow later in section 4.3, where he says that he will describe the conspiracy of Catiline, quam verissime potero, I will do it as truthfully as I can. But it is preceded by a remarkable sketch of Sallus's own earlier life. This is in sections 3 through 4.2. He tells us that as a young man, he was drawn by an initial enthusiasm into politics. He says, Initio studio ad rem publicam latus sum. I was carried up by a zeal for the republic. That is, for engaging in politics. But there were many things against him. Politics was debased, he says, and though his animus, that is, his soul, rejected many symptoms of that debasement, he was at a weak stage of his life, an imbecilla aetas, which was corrupted and gripped by ambition. Although he disagreed with the wicked behavior of others, nevertheless the desire for honor seized him, and therefore when he had decided to spend the remainder of his life away from politics, where he says in section 4.1, mihi reliquam aetatem a republica procul habendam de crevi. His plan was not to waste time in idle pursuits, but to return to his initial enthusiasm, from which evil ambition had kept him. That is, he says, a quo incepto studioque eodem regressus. I wanted to come back to my initial undertaking and interest. He determined to write down the deeds of the Roman people in a selective manner, as each seemed worthy to record, especially since his soul, his animus, was now free from the hope, fear, and partisanship of political life. So this is the whole sketch that he gives us about himself. Now, Sallust's sketch of his own life falls neatly into two parts. In the first and less credible part, that is section 3 through 5, he defensively portrays himself at the mercy of external forces. He uses passive voice verbs, latus sum, his aetas tenebator, me vexabat. All these things are happening to him at this time. Now, he doesn't mention, though, that he was actually expelled from the Senate in the year 50 BC. He was expelled for several years, though it may be alluded to in the statement that many things were against him. But still, though, that's a big thing that he leaves out. And in the second and more credible part, that is section 4, 1 through 2, it is to Sallust himself that initiatives are attributed. There he switches to active voice verbs. He says, decrevi, statui, I decreed, I decided. This entirely disguises the fact that his permanent departure from public life was forced upon him, we know, by charges of extortion arising from his governorship of Africa Nova in the years 46 to 45, where he basically fleeced the locals and, extorted tons of money out of them. The two parts of the sketch are separated by a conversion, as it were, represented by Sallust's self-styled decision to leave public life. Yet the striking feature of his new life is that he describes it as a return, a regressus, to a pursuit which he has not previously mentioned, but which is expressed in remarkably similar terms to his old life. He uses that phrase, incepto studioque, whereas before he had mentioned initio studio. So Sallust's decision consists in a vicarious return to politics through the medium of historiography, a further blurring of the roles of scriptor and auctor that he had mentioned and which we mentioned earlier in his introduction. Now, stories of conversion are not uncommon in ancient literature, and Sallust's conversion acquires moral enhancement from being modeled on Plato's seventh letter, where Plato describes a youth spent in discreditable society, followed by a life devoted to philosophy. It is in the nature of such conversions that one's new life is a moral improvement on the old, and although Sallust does not turn to philosophy, but rather returns to politics in quotation marks, that is, to writing historiography, we might expect him to say that on his return he has edited out any immoral features which characterized his earlier life. But the opposite happens. When he announces his subject in the very next sentence, it becomes clear that it is precisely the immorality which, in the form of the Catilinarian conspiracy, he has edited in. He says the following: Igitur de Catilinae coniuratione quam verisume potero paucis absolvam. Nam id facinus in primis ego memorabile existumo sceleres atque periculi novitate. Therefore I shall deal briefly with the conspiracy of Catiline as truthfully as I can, for I consider that action to be especially memorable for the novelty of the crime and of the danger. His conversion turns out to be a conversion not at all, but rather a reversion. Sallust's introduction of his subject is followed, as he explains in section 4-5, by a necessary sketch of Catiline himself. This is in section 5-1-8. And Catiline is revealed to be a child of this corrupt age. The reference to political corruption itself, in turn, prompts Sallust to engage in a digression in which he charts the earlier history of Rome from its beginnings to its degenerative present. This retrospective digression is lengthy. It goes from section 6-13 and recalls a similar digression by Thucydides in his first book, in book 1, section 2-21, the so-called archaeology. And clearly, and this is something that has been known for centuries, that Thucydides is the historian whom, above all, Sallust was recognized as imitating in antiquity as well. And during the course of this digression, that is, of Thucydides makes the point that one cannot judge power from the physical appearance of a city, and he gives the example of, if Sparta were to be deserted, future generations would scarcely infer from its buildings that its power had been as great as its renown. Conversely, if Athens were to be deserted, people would infer from its ruins that its power had been double what it really was. Therefore, one cannot infer from the smallness of Mycenae, for instance. Thucydides goes on to say that the Trojan expedition was small. One has to rely on the evidence of Homer, who was a poet, and would have therefore magnified its size. All of those various points recur in Sallust's digression, where they are put to a different purpose. Sallust acknowledges that Athens's achievements were quite magnificent, but quite rather less than maintained by fame, he says, in section 8-2. It was because Athens produced a crop of great talents that its achievements are celebrated across the world as the greatest. Pro maximis celebrantur, he says, section 8-3. And so, quote, so the excellence of those who acted is as great as outstanding talents were able to elevate it in words, end quote, section 8-4. In this passage, therefore, which seems to constitute a digression embedded within a digression, Sallust caps the point which he had made considerably earlier in the preface in section 3-1-2, in which he had argued for the general equality of the writer, scriptor, to the doer of deeds, the auctor, while acknowledging that the latter enjoyed the greater glory. Here, though, at this later point, also in the preface, he makes the key point that the glory of doers depends upon writers. It seems that what Sallust is trying to get at here is he's implicitly arguing for the primacy of writers, and therefore of his own post-conversion self over the actual doers of history. Okay. Sallust's brilliance in his defense of the activity of writing is itself symptomatic of a society which, as his own works amply demonstrate, placed a premium on military and political action. The most famous parallel occurs in the elder Cato's Origenes, an historical work which begins with a familiar defense with a similar defense as to what Sallust is talking about, and with which Sallust was evidently extremely familiar. A contemporary example of Sallust is Cicero, who defends his philosophical writing on the grounds that he is compelled to endure exile. He mentions this in his work De Officiis, Book 3, chapters 1 through 4. No such stigma attached to the production of literature in Greek society, and that's interesting. And it is striking, I think, that Thucydides, despite having been exiled from Athens, nowhere attempts to defend his historiography as a substitute for politics or military duty. There is nevertheless a parallel between Thucydides' case and that of Sallust, because, as we've seen, the latter's temporary exile from the Senate in 50 was followed by a virtual but permanent exile from public life in the year 45. The Augustan historian and critic Dionysius of Halicarnassus believed that Thucydides' exile conditioned his writing of history. He argued that Thucydides was embittered by his exile and was therefore predisposed to attack and to criticize Athens in his work. Does the parallelism, I hear you ask, between Thucydides and Sallust extend as far as this? Well, as the first sentence of Sallust's main narrative makes clear, this would be section 14.1, the digression with which the preface concludes is designed to show that Catiline represents the nadir which Rome has now reached, the low point that Rome has now reached. Almost the first allegation in the main narrative is the story that Catiline, in order to marry the daughter of a former mistress, killed his own son, to whom that daughter was, that woman, the daughter, objected. This is mentioned in section 15 too. A rumor, this was a rumor singled out by Catullus, the poet who was a contemporary, as symptomatic of contemporary frightfulness. He mentions this in his very long poem, Catullus 64, lines 401 to 402. A later digressive passage begins with Sallust's recollection that the events of 20 years previously seemed to him by far the most wretched in the history of the Roman Empire. He says, multo maxime miserabile. This is section 36.4. And elsewhere, Roman society is described as being subjected metaphorically to earthquakes, section 31.1, to plague, section 36.5, and fire, section 38.1. On the evidence of the Bellum Catilinae, it is scarcely surprising that a historian in the 2nd century AD, echoing Sallust's own words at section 3.2, maintained that Sallust, quote, criticizes his own times and attacks their failings. Et tempora reprehendit sua et delicta carpit. It certainly would not be difficult to hold that Sallust used the medium of historiography to avenge himself on the society which had twice rejected him. And yet, Sallust's indictment of contemporary Rome comes oddly from one whose defense of historiography in these early sections seems to rest largely on the assumption that the role of the historian is to speak well of the state or to praise it. Remember, he said, benedicere, celebrantur, extollere. Sallust's subtle and elaborate defense of the writing of history in his preface fails to embrace the kind of historiography which he himself practices in the work as a whole. And that's a great irony. This failure seems all the more stark if we consider the likely background against which Sallust's work was written. Consider, for instance, that about 15 years before Sallust produced his Bellum Catilinae, Cicero had written a letter to another historian, his friend Lucius Lucaeus, asking him to write a monograph on the Catilinarian conspiracy and its aftermath. This we read about in Cicero's letters Ad Familiares 5:12. And though Cicero envisioned that Lucaeus would attack Cicero's own opponents, he says, reprehendes ea quae vituperanda duces, he saw the primary purpose of the work as being that my name should be illuminated and celebrated in your writing, illustrator et celebrator. There is no evidence that Lucaeus ever succumbed to Cicero's eloquent persuasion. Instead, though, it was Sallust who took up the challenge of treating the Catilinarian conspiracy, and his attitude towards Cicero is anything but straightforwardly heroizing. The consul Cicero's first Catilinarian, which famously begins with the phrase "O usque tandem abutere Catilina patientia nostra," how much longer, Catiline, will you abuse our tolerance, is dispatched with the mere words, then Marcus Tullius, the consul, delivered a sparkling speech and used for the state, and one useful for the state, of which he later published a written version, end quote. That is in section 31:6 of Sallust. What is the tone of that sentence? Is Cicero being dismissed with faint praise? Or is Sallust inhibited by the fact of the speech's publication? Of course, earlier, Sallust had put Cicero's famous exordium, quo usque tandem, into the mouth of none other than Catiline himself, the villain, in section 29. That is 29. Quae quo usque tandem patiemini fortissume viri. How much longer will you tolerate these things, O bravest of men? Catiline says. Is this malicious parody or sincere compliment? How significant is it that Cicero later appears as the personified protector of Rome, the protection of Rome in 36:3? Cicero urbe praesidio. Cicero is the praesidium of Rome. The answers to such questions have been so varied that we may safely assume that Sallust's treatment of Cicero is far removed from that which Cicero asked of his friend Lucaeus. Even more striking is Sallust's handling of the crucial debate at which the fate of the conspirators was decided, and which he prefaces with a brief introduction. This is section 50, 3-5. Making no reference at all to Cicero's fourth Catilinarian speech, Sallust gives a very long speech to both Caesar, who speaks in favor of leniency, section 51, and the younger Cato, who speaks in favor of the death penalty, the severitas, in chapter 52. It is the latter, of course, who wins the day, and the assembled senators praise the virtus of the man who is considered clarus atque magnus, distinguished and great. This reaction is then used by Sallust to contrive a digression on the significance of virtus in Roman history. This is a very important section of section 53, which leads him to the statement that, quote, in my lifetime there have been only two men of substantial virtus, though of differing characteristics, Marcus Cato and Gaius Caesar. This is section 53 again. Finally, this statement in its turn is used to contrive a comparison of the two great men in section 54, a famous comparison for which the technical term is synkrisis. And it turns out to be as mystifying as Sallust's treatment of Cicero. Every reader who believes he ranks Caesar over Cato is challenged by other readers who thinks that he privileges Cato over Caesar. And so, in other words, any case that has been made finds proponents of exactly the opposite position. No less difficult to read is the presentation of the villain Catiline himself. Sallust makes Catiline, in his first speech, complain that his enemies have an abundance of riches, quote, which they pour into building on the sea and into leveling mountains, section 20:11. Now, this was precisely Sallust's own complaint in the introductory digression, section 13, where he says many private individuals have mountains, many private individuals have mountains, by many private individuals have mountains been overturned and seas paved over, end quote. Likewise, Catiline's capacity for vigilance and toil in section 5.3, patiens vigiliae, is repeated again also at 27.2, vigilare neque insomniis neque labore fatigare. This finds its echo in the sketch of Caesar, 54. Caesar laborare vigilare. Since such parallels link Catiline either with Sallust himself or with a man of outstanding virtus, it is perhaps possible to argue that the conspirator is presented as a sort of mixed or complex character. On the other hand, Catiline, in his introductory sketch, is said to be possessed of an evil and twisted personality. In section 5.1, ingenio malo provoque, a description which seems comprehensively damning and to influence our reading of the man thereafter. If Catiline echoes an admirable sentiment of Sallust, that is no doubt an illustration of his capacity for limitless simulation, quos rei lubet simulator, section 5.4. If he shares vigilance and toil with Caesar, we should remember the implications that he displayed these qualities from adolescence in civil wars, which he had welcomed, and that in Sallust's view, Caesar desired conventional arenas in which to demonstrate his virtus. Again in section 54. Catiline lusted at taking over the state. This is mentioned in section 5.6. Libido maxima rei publicae capiundae. It is difficult not to agree with Sir Ronald Syme, therefore, that the Bellum Catilinae is built up around a villain. And yet, Catiline's villainy is hardly in evidence at the end of the monograph. When he finds himself cut off and with nowhere to turn, he decides to join battle with the consul Gaius Antonius, section 57.5. And in a long passage of direct speech, section 58, he delivers a pre-battle exhortation whose noble sentiments, quote, appear strangely in the mouth of a debauched conspirator against his country. That is a quote from Sir Ronald Syme. Antonius, for his part, is ignominiously kept from the forthcoming confrontation by bad feet, and is obliged to transfer, that is, he has gout, and he is obliged to transfer command to a deputy, Marcus Petreius, whose own pre-battle exhortation is restricted to 2 lines of indirect speech, section 59. After a battle is joined, Catiline strikes at the enemy, saepe hostem ferire, section 64, as if he were a hero from the past. Quisque hostem ferire. This is a phrase that Sallust himself uses to describe the good old days of Rome in section 7.6. Catiline in this battle performs all the activities associated with an ideal general, section 64, and makes more progress than Petreius had expected. Finally, when his forces are inevitably routed by superior numbers, he is struck down while still fighting, exactly as he had urged upon his troops, using the same words. He died pugnans, section 67, and he had urged his troops to die pugnantes, section 58.21. It is at this point, with the battle completed, that Sallust invites his readers directly to see. He actually even uses the second person singular, cerneres, you would see, in section 61.1, how much boldness there had been in Catiline's army, quanta audacia. This is, of course, the boldness in war which had characterized the early republic in section 9.3, audacia in bello. And the further echo of Catiline's speech, where he talks about quanta audacia, indicates that his confidence in the excellence of his troops had not been misplaced. Almost each man, Sallust notes, now covered with his body in death the place which he had captured by fighting while still alive. And those few dislodged by their opponents revealed by their frontal wounds that they had died bravely. You see, this was always the standard thing to say in antiquity. If you had wounds on your back, that meant you were running away. But if all your wounds were on the front, that meant you died fighting bravely. Finally, Catiline himself, having penetrated furthest of all of his soldiers into the enemy ranks, he was found to be still breathing, retaining in his countenance the defiance of spirit which had distinguished him during his lifetime. Ferociam anime, this is section 61.4. Yet, given the ways in which the reader's sympathies have been manipulated in favor of Catiline in these final pages, we seem to be far removed from the defiant spirit, the animus ferox, which, in the introductory character sketch, was encouraged by the consciousness of his crimes, the conscientia scelerum. Whatever interpretation, therefore, one places upon Catiline earlier in the narrative, there seems to be no doubt that, at the very end, he has become something of a tragic hero. And the 2nd century AD historian Florus, after quoting Sallust's description of Catiline's body, adds, quote, "He had the finest of deaths, if he had fallen thus for his country." Moving on now to the second of Sallust's works, the Bellum Jugurthinum, we see that causation is one of Sallust's preoccupations. In each of his works, he identifies a plurality of starting points: the beginning of social decline at Rome, the beginning of deep political and social corruption, the point at which the crisis, that is, his particular topic, began. One consistent turning point is the destruction of Carthage and the consequent removal of the so-called metus punicus, or the fear of Carthage, or metus hostilis, the fear of the external enemy, in 146 BC. That is, Sallust's theory is that as long as the Romans faced a strong external threat, they would remain united in self-defense, and their civil affairs would remain peaceful as a result. According to Sallust's analysis, the Jugurthine War stemmed from the cataclysmic combination of the Numidian prince Jugurtha and the Roman nobles who dominated the corrupt society that was spinning out of control in the mid-2nd century. But the war was itself the origin of still greater conflict. Sallust had used the story of Catiline to illustrate the internal problems of the state at a particular point in time. In the Bellum Jugurthinum, Sallust expands those parameters, analyzing the interplay between foreign and domestic upheavals and tracing their implications for what, of course, is his past, but his future compared to what would, from the point of view of the narrative itself. The Bellum Jugurthinum, therefore, stands halfway between a monograph and an annals. The person of Jugurtha provides a formal focus and unity to the narrative, akin to that provided by the subject of a biography, but the narrative reaches beyond its own boundaries in a way that the Bellum Catilinae does not. Its extended narrative spans more than a dozen years, with a rough chronological organization by consul, and the alternation of res externae, foreign affairs, and res internae, domestic affairs, which is characteristic of annalistic history, annals. This is something that, while Sallust's treatment of the political issues in particular gives the sense that the story being told is only part of a larger whole. Though the Numidian War eventually ends, we are not given the narrative satisfaction of seeing Jugurtha die. Moreover, Sallust repeatedly reminds us that the Roman characters will play crucial roles in the battles of the late Republic, which in turn prepare for the Caesarean Civil War. Historically, Jugurtha's ambition and guerrilla tactics were largely an irritation and embarrassment to Rome. For Sallust, the story provides a convenient means by which to investigate Marius's rise to power and the origins of his conflict with Sulla, which would eventually lead to the devastation of Italy and of its republican government. Yet, if Sallust's real interest in this second monograph is the Roman political system, his treatment of the res externae is not perfunctory. The topography and people of Numidia, together with their leader Jugurtha, are topics of intellectual and thematic importance. The length and scope of the story mirror the expanse of the country in which much of the action takes place. The tactics necessary for fighting a guerrilla war, with its constantly changing stratagems and deceptive appearances, find their analog in the nomadic character of the Numidians, whose volatility makes them eager for revolution. At the start of the war narrative proper, Sallust establishes the connection between geography, ethnography, and theme in a formal description of the province. This is sections 17 through 19. He returns to the land repeatedly, above all to its lack of defining features, and therefore to an almost magical quickness with which those who are familiar with the terrain can move about in it. And he also talks about its disorienting sands in section 53 and 79. Jugurtha himself is the focus of this thematics of disorder, interposing delay, deception, and an almost hallucinatory mobility between himself and the Romans, keeping them from taking control. The first third of the monograph focuses closely on Jugurtha's career, moving from his youth in section 6 through his military training in sections 7 through 8, and the death of his adoptive father, Micipsa, in section 11, followed by his ascension to sole power after murdering his stepbrothers in sections 12 through 21, and by the first stages of the war, which culminate in his victory over the Roman army under the command of Aulus Albinus, in section 38 through 39. Each contact between Jugurtha and the Romans results in some kind of illicit delay, exchange, or disorder in both the military and the domestic arenas. Roman legates are kept from meeting those they are sent to contact. A surrender is arranged in which Jugurtha promises one thing openly but negotiates a second secret bargain. Roman armies are deluded, engagements deferred or complicated by mirage and masquerade. Above all, constant bribery and unregulated exchange of goods corrupt the Romans and defer settlement of any kind. This persistent refusal of closure extends to the monograph's political theme, which is structured around the contrived but traditional antithesis of the plebs versus the nobles, who are labeled at the outset as proud superbii. This, too, is affected by Jugurtha's affinities with chaos. The long-standing antagonism between the orders at Rome is worsened by the Roman aristocratic commanders' connivance with Jugurtha and their consequent surrender in the field, until eventually the balance of power in Rome is tipped far enough for the plebeian leadership to take direct action against the Senate, first through radical rhetoric, then by means of legislation. Sallust marks the kingship between the military and political realms by punctuating this first third of the monograph by two digressions: the African excursus, sections 17 through 19, and the chapters on the nature of the political parties and factions, in which he analyzes the pernicious and widespread power of Roman political factions in sections 41 through 42. And he balances ethnographies, bracketing the complex interaction between Jugurtha and Rome. The second main section, section 43 through 83, belongs to Quintus Caecilius Metellus Numidicus, the first commander to have a measure of success against Jugurtha. He brings with him, however, the twin seeds of his own destruction: his opposition to the plebs, later specified as superbia, pride, a rare fault in a character that is otherwise laudably fair, as Sallust says in sections 43 and 45. And he also brings with him the seed of his other fault that he brings with him is his own lieutenant, Gaius Marius, in section 46-7. The pride part is formally introduced, though it does not manifest itself until later in section 64. The lieutenant Gaius Marius, on the other hand, slips into the narrative, his official presentation delayed until he reveals his true ambition, the consulate, at which point Sallust gives him a formal character sketch. This is section 63 through 4. Metellus' progress against Jugurtha is considerable, and though he cannot bring the war to a close, he manages to reduce the prince to despair, increasing his normal tendency to disorder and rapid mobility, while also restoring order to the armies that had been corrupted and dispersed by their contact with Jugurthine tactics. Part of Metellus' success stems from his use of sieges, as opposed to the open battles that had ruined Albinus, section 38, and nearly destroyed his own troops in sections 50 through 53. His attacks on towns, which owe much less to chance and stratagems of deceit, are much more to the Romans' taste than Jugurtha's slippery guerrilla warfare. Concomitantly, Metellus shows an ever-increasing ability to turn Jugurtha's own stratagems against him, a case of using like to be like. But it is Marius who is most like Jugurtha, and who consequently will be most effective, therefore, against him in this mythico-historical narrative in which it takes a beast to kill a beast. The monograph's final section opens with his election to the consulate, an election which, as he is a self-made novus homo, or new man, that is one whose ancestors have never attained the consulship before, his election to the consulate overturns traditional categories and expectations. Jugurthine disorder here enters Roman political life with a vengeance, though Marius's particular brand of chaos is political. His first consular act is a blend of the political and the military. He enrolls an army not, as was usual from the wealthy classes, non more maiorem neque ex classibus, but according to individuals' desire, libido, as Sallust puts it. That is, he takes volunteers, most of whom are eager for the spoils of war. This is all in section 84 and then again in 86. The unregulated exercise of libido is one of Sallust's favorite symptoms of chaos, evoking the transgression of boundaries that inevitably accompanies revolution. The new Marian army challenges the basis on which Roman armies had traditionally been recruited. Only those with property, that is, with a vested financial interest in the state, were previously eligible to serve. And while Sallust does not dwell on the change per se, simply describing it in a couple of sentences, he does highlight it by giving Marius a lengthy speech of exhortation in section 85, explicitly designed to encourage enlistment and to irritate the nobility. This substantial narrative pause, the longest speech in the monograph, is Marius's opportunity to elaborate his personal and political credo, and as such it functions as an elaborate demonstration of his own boundary-crossing libido, his double desire for personal advancement and political change. Now, from the point of view of style, direct speech is carefully apportioned in the Bellum Jugurthinum, as in the Bellum Catilinae. Of the three full-scale orations, all are delivered by relative outsiders. The Numidian Prince Adherbal in section 14, which only has 4 OCT pages, Oxford Classical Text pages. Another is given by the radical tribune Memmius in section 31, which contains 3.5 Oxford Classical Text pages. And lastly, the plebeian consul Marius in section 85, which has a full 5.5 Oxford Classical Text pages. Only briefly do we hear the voice of the traditional aristocrat poke through all of this. A short letter from Scipio in section 92, a senatorial communication in section 104, a few words from the eloquent Sulla in section 102. The situation is even worse than in the Bellum Catilinae, therefore. We're balancing Catiline's 2 dangerous seductive orations, section 20 and 58 of that narrative. We at least heard from 2 exemplars, however partial, of the old-fashioned virtus, Caesar and Cato. Now, in all his works, Sallust took Thucydides' famous description of the stasis at Corcyra very much to heart, repeatedly evoking that atmosphere of civil disorder in which the slipperiness of words at once reflects and creates a moral and political chaos that is ultimately as slippery and evasive as any disease. It is axiomatic in much ancient political thought that the truly good should speak a steady, truthful language in which words corresponded to reality, while those who seek change and who favor the non-aristocratic classes speak cleverly but dangerously, to make the weaker argument appear the stronger, as Aristophanes puts it famously in The Clouds. The fact that the aristocratic voice is relatively mute in the Bellum Jugurthinum might suggest that demagogic rhetoric has simply taken its place. But in fact, Sallust is more subtle than that. His speakers are far from upholding traditional ideals, but what they offer in their place is a challenge rather than a defeat. So we hear from a foreign ally whose values are more Roman than those of the corrupt Romans, an incendiary plebeian demagogue who makes a fair amount of sense, and a charismatic military leader who himself inverts the conventional aristocratic charges against sophistic speech. Put it all together, clever rhetorical training, as Marius says, is an elite preserve with which the senators have masked their incompetence, used fancy words as a substitute for their non-existent deeds, deceived, cajoled, and oppressed the poor. Marius's radical speech eloquently presents the new virtus of the novus homo. In the narrative of the Bellum Jugurthinum, it aligns him with the foreigner Adherbal and the tribune Memmius, both of whom speak on behalf of groups at the mercy of the aristocratic government. It has critical differences from those speeches, however. Though delivered in order to irritate the aristocracy, as we are told in section 84, nobilitatem exagitandi causa, it is a speech by a consul, and as such marks Marius's entrance into the aristocratic government that he professes to despise. As Sallust has already remarked, at this time plebs and nobles behaved similarly, section 40. The political turmoil caused by Marius's election is not a final one, to be followed by a new domestic peace under a new dispensation. Rather, it heralds more of the same. When Marius arrives in Africa with his revolutionary army, section 86, his military successes drive Jugurtha to increasingly desperate measures until the prince practically fades out of the picture. He last participates actively in the narrative at section 101, where he escapes the carnage of his army's defeat. But as Metellus was overshadowed from the beginning by his own replacement, Marius, so Marius too soon faces a rival, the man who will be largely responsible for ending the war, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And Sulla arrives during the siege of Jugurtha's fort on the Molucca. His appearance comes close on the heels of a hard-won victory in which Marius barely avoids yet another stalemate. We are told in section 94:7, thus Marius's rashness, corrected by chance, snatched glory from blame. End quote. Sulla's presence demands attention. His entrance mandates both a formal character sketch, section 95, and a brief discussion of his model relationship with soldiers and consul alike, section 96. This formal introduction effectively contrasts with Sallust's treatment of Marius, whom he mentions 10 times before officially introducing him at section 63. These different entrances into the narrative reflect traditional views in Roman literature of the men's respective social positions. Marius, the novus homo, the outsider, the underling in a sense, eager for revolution, novae res, infiltrates the military narrative as part of the nobilis. As part of the nobilis Metellus's cohort, gradually becoming visible owing to his own exceptional talent and because he attracts the notice of the divine, that is a soothsayer at Utica who predicts his future greatness, in section 63:1. The mythico-historical paradigm for his story is that of Servius Tullius, the sixth king of ancient Rome, of the regal period, who was a slave's child who came to the notice of King Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome, after a divine omen. He eventually became king, instituted great reforms, and if he had not been assassinated, Livy tells us, he would perhaps have ended the monarchy altogether. That is in Book 1 of Livy, chapters 39 through 48. Sulla, on the other hand, as befits a patrician, arrives with some panoply, interrupting the narrative. But like contemporary Roman society, in which corruption has pervaded both the orders, the plebs, and the patricians, Sulla's aristocratic gloss cannot hide the fact that his acts and character are destined not only to bring ruin to the state, but also to compromise the honesty or offend the propriety of the historians who try to write his res gestae, his achievements. It is, in fact, Sulla who, in a series of involved negotiations, engineers the betrayal of Jugurtha and hands him over to Marius in section 113. The moment itself receives only brief attention before Sallust steps back to report with curious obliqueness the final acts of the war. At the same time, a battle against the Gauls was lost by our generals, Sallust tells us, Quintus Caepio and Gnaeus Mallius, which shook all Italy with fear. For the Romans then considered, and indeed have done so right up to our own time, that while all other things are easy targets for our valor, we fight with the Gauls for our lives, not just for glory. But after it was reported that the war in Numidia was finished, and Jugurtha was being brought in chains to Rome, Marius was elected consul in absentia, and the province of Gaul was assigned to him. As consul, he triumphed on the 1st of January with great glory, and at that time the hopes and resources of the state were all placed on him. Those are the final words of the entire monograph. A return to Rome at the end of a campaign is characteristic of military narratives, but in the Bellum Jugurthinum it closes both the final section and the book as a whole by forming a bracket with Marius's first election and recruiting activities discussed in sections 84 through 86, and with the announcement of Sallust's whole theme in the very opening section, section 5 of the work. We return as well in this final paragraph to the structuring device of the hero's lifespan. The combination of Jugurtha's transport to Rome and Marius's triumph would imply to all Roman readers that he would be executed as Marius reached the height of his gloria. It is ultimately not any closing event, however, but instead Marius's beginning that this ending celebrates. He triumphs on the first day of the new year after being re-elected consul. The iterated title in the penultimate sentence underscores his exceptional reappointment. He would hold 4 more consulships in the next 5 years. The first of those consulships fades in importance, becoming a foil to the second, as the great glory accruing to his victory over Jugurtha sets the stage for the far more serious fight impending against the Gauls. And so this last paragraph of the monograph, in closing the Jugurthine War and opening up another campaign, contributes to the sense that the Bellum Jugurthinum is a historical fragment, as David Levine from NYU has put it. It is part of a larger whole. It's part of an analytic history in embryo. And given what we know about Marius's future and his war with Sulla, the hopes of the people with which Sallust ends must give us a terrible foreboding. Now, Jugurtha's affinity with and ability to produce a chaos that profoundly affects Roman military and political stability, I've already kind of sketched, but Jugurtha also possesses exceptionally good qualities as well. He has virtus, he has intelligence, he has great military skill. He is loved rather than envied by his peers, as we're told in section 6. This is a remarkable achievement in the atmosphere of envy that conventionally attends excellence, and his talents eventually lead Scipio Aemilianus to regard Jugurtha as his right-hand man, while other Romans hasten to patronize him in sections 7 through 8. All of these are Roman qualities. The only specifically Numidian activity he is said to pursue is hunting, chapter 6. Incidentally, this is a training for war among Roman youth as well, though. In this mixture of corruption and virtus, Jugurtha resembles Marius as a kind of complex character. He also resembles Sulla. He certainly resembles Catiline and Caesar. Great figures who combine, in Ronald Syme's words, energy and criminal ambition. In particular, Jugurtha is in some senses a double for Marius. They served together under Scipio at Numantia and probably knew one another, a well-known fact which Sallust does not mention, but which he invites us to recall. by dwelling on Jugurtha's close relations with the Romans in Scipio's entourage. When we were told in section 7.6, Scipio considered him among his friends. And also in section 7, Jugurtha had bound him, Jugurtha had bound many to him with friendship. Both Marius and Jugurtha each come from nowhere to displace a high-born, therefore rightful leader. And finally, Jugurtha essentially vanishes from the narrative as Marius becomes the dominant character. In the narrative economy of the monograph, Jugurtha and Marius are in some senses interchangeable. Fittingly enough, as the latter will go on to do the damage to Rome that Jugurtha wanted to do but could not. Unlike Marius, however, Jugurtha is also an African. In the Roman imagination of the late Republic, that heritage aligns him with the other great African enemies, like Cleopatra, with whom he is linked by Propertius, a poet of the Augustan period, in a poem celebrating Augustus's triumph after Actium. This is Propertius, Book 4, poem 6, lines 65 through 6. And also, of course, we can't forget about the Carthaginian Hannibal, who similarly blended great virtue and great faults, as, for instance, Livy tells us in Book 21, Chapter 4 of his work. Hannibal plays no part in the Bellum Jugurthinum, but his city, Carthage, even though at the time of the Jugurthan War it no longer existed, has an important place both in the narrative and in Sallust's historical imagination. Indeed, a pronounced effect of identifying this relatively insignificant African war as a primary cause of the devastation of Italy, which Sallust makes in section 5. An effect of doing that is to draw attention to Carthage and to the effects of its removal. Like Jugurtha, Carthage is paradoxical and composite. As the city whose external threat kept Rome from collapsing into internal disorder, whose enmity made Roman political concord possible, and whose destruction in 146 BC, at the height of Roman military success in the Mediterranean, Sallust identifies as the first cause of Rome's decline, Carthage naturally acquires an almost magical aura. It appears 3 times in the Bellum Jugurthinum. In each of the 3 authorial digressions, for instance, in sections 5, section 14, and section 81, the Carthaginians are mentioned in all the sections, but they do not participate significantly in the war. Each time Carthage is mentioned, the city stabilizes actual or potential order. That's a paradox. It's a paradox within a paradox. As its own composite nature, the virtuous enemy, the danger that makes safe, ought to, that it is the thing that exists, and yet and by the fact that it does exist, it inhibits the unity that it should be producing. The city of Carthage enters the Bellum Jugurthinum at the culmination of the African ethnography. We are told later the Phoenicians founded Hippo, Hadrumentum, Lepkis, and other cities along the shore. Around Carthage, I think it is better, about Carthage, it is better, I think, to be silent than to say too little, since time admonishes me to hasten to another topic, Sallust says. Sallust's silence in the face of a topic that is too much to handle is conventional. We see this in other writers. But at this point, the convention conveys the city's power and fascination. Better to say nothing than to say too little. The bulk and importance of Carthage threatened to take over the historian's project, to divert him from his task. Turning instead to geography, Sallust then briefly sketches the different African territories, paying special attention to the Carthaginian boundaries and the shifting sands of the Syrtes, both of which will become important later. And so toward Katabathmos, the place which separates Egypt from Africa. As you go along the coast, Cyrene comes first, and then the 2 Syrtes and Lepkis between them, then the altars of the Philaenae, a place which the Carthaginians considered the border of their empire in the direction of Egypt, and afterwards other Punic cities. End quote. The borders of Carthage appear again in the final short paragraph detailing the rulers of the African provinces at the time of the war. This is in section 19. In its first appearances, then, Carthage is both unspeakable and a place that delimits, marking the borders of Sallust's own current historiographical project and of a narrative section therein. In the second of the monograph's digressions, the Roman political ethnography, discussed at sections 41 through 42, Carthage appears in the familiar guise of the metus hostilis, the fear of an external enemy, but it is put in counterpoise to discord and wandering on a metaphorical level. This digression is Sallust's response to the Mamilian Commission, the plebeian attempt to identify and curb patrician corruption, talked about in section 40. In it, he anatomizes social and political corruption in Rome after the Third Punic War and the Gracchan reforms of the following decades. Carthage, the weight which kept Roman power from turning on itself and spinning out of control, leads off his analysis, forming, as in the African excursus, a boundary marker, as he says in section 41, for before Carthage was destroyed, but when that fear had left men's minds, and so on. What Carthage controls here is the maintenance of categories. Without it, trustworthy distinctions and definitions break down. Bad things arise from good. Success generates disaster. Libertas, freedom, becomes libido, desire. This is all delineated in section 41. Power and greed, qualities that respect no limits, invade the state, considering nothing worthwhile or out of bounds. The effect, says Sallust, was like an earthquake, a terremotus. Finally, towards the end of Metellus's command in Africa, messengers come to ask the Romans to settle an incipient war in Leptis Magna, a city formerly in Punic territory. Though Metellus sends 4 cohorts in section 77, what happens to them is not narrated. The narrative impulse turns instead to an excursus on an ancient boundary dispute between Carthage and Cyrene, the next great city to the east. This is all mentioned in sections 78 through 79. Leptis Magna played no part in this dispute other than to be situated in the middle of the desert, whose shifting sands, like the Syrtes, the coastal sandbanks, prevent the rival powers from fixing their borders. The heart of the digression is the story of the outstanding and wondrous deed of 2 Carthaginian brothers, the Fellaini, discussed in section 79, who agree to be buried alive in the desert so as to settle the dispute between the city of Cyrene and their own. Henceforward, their tomb and the altar there erected mark the line between the territories. For the third time in the narrative, then, Carthage fixes a stable point, here defining the boundary between 2 discordant groups. This final digression is carefully linked to the other 2. The civil discord of Leptis recalls the excursus on party politics, while I've already mentioned the altars of the Phileni at the end of the section on Punic territory in the African ethnography in section 19. These 2 composite elements, Jugurtha and Carthage, thus have opposite effects, the one producing disorder and challenging limits, the other marking stability and constituting fines, boundaries, both in the text and in history. The city's destruction, finally removes the greatest threat to Roman security, but paradoxically, it also unleashes the forces of disorder and corruption, both within Rome and without it, in the person of Jugurtha. Now, moving on to Sallust's fragmentary work that we have, the Historiae. I'd like to begin this discussion with 2 quotations, one from Sir Ronald Syme, who I've talked about many times already today, and another from P.A. Brunt. Syme says, in these diverse ways, the lost masterpiece becomes palpable: content, architecture, and tone. And P.A. Brunt says, in my judgment, the most learned and acute scholars have often been overconfident in delineating the scope of lost histories and the qualities of their authors. End quote. And so it is that 2 eminent ancient historians of the 20th century, on the problems of interpreting a fragmentary text such as the Historiae have very divergent opinions. Sallust's last work has come down to us in various ways. 4 speeches and 2 letters were excerpted, probably during the imperial period of Rome, and have their own manuscript tradition. There are a very few manuscript and papyrus fragments of other parts of the work, and many short quotations, allusions, and paraphrases are found in the texts of grammarians and other ancient scholars. Finally, the Historiae were used by later writers, for instance, Pliny the Elder in his Natural History and Plutarch in his Life of Sertorius, from which some details of Sallust's work can be inferred. Enough in terms of sheer quantity has survived to give us some idea, if not a palpable sense, of its scope and some of its qualities. Following an analytic format, the narrative alternated between res internae and res externae that I've already talked about. There were at least 3 formal geographical excursus, and the story itself was focused on its major characters, a concentration on the deeds of great men, befitting this type of history that is res gestae. Any relatively cautious treatment of the Historiae will tend toward the atomizing, as the individual pieces lend themselves to a commentary format rather than a synthetic approach. My own view, or of the whole, and we might even say like the view of many scholars in general, has naturally been skewed by the accidents of transmission. The speeches and letters in particular have received attention disproportionate to the amount they would perhaps have received had they been preserved in their original narrative context. And indeed, until Reynolds's 1991 Oxford Classical Text, they were the only fragments regularly included in editions of Sallust's other works. In general, the Historiae makes exceptional demands on the reader, who is forced not only to try to interpret the text, but first and concomitantly, since no reconstruction of fragments is ever final, to reconstruct, to fill in the gaps, to try to see the original picture. Still, though, one can suggest possible directions for thinking about this analytic history, and in particular about the 3 elements which stand out in the fragments, namely Sallust's prefatory comments on his profession, his character assessments, including the long portions of direct speech, oratio recta, and the ethnographical descriptions. Ethnographical and geographical descriptions. In his preface, Sallust clearly chose a different route from the philosophical approach of the monographs. He does not seem to have returned to the mind-body antithesis of the Bellum Catilinae or to the lament on contemporary decline of the Bellum Jugurthinum. Instead, an evaluation of other historians preceded an overview of the years leading up to his chosen period. Several fragments show that Sallust deployed the major conventions of historiographical introductions, beginning with the opening words, Res Populi Romani, Marco Lepido, Quinto Catulo consulibus, ac dende militiae et domi gestas composui. I have composed the military and political history of the Roman people from the consulate of Marcus Lepidus and Quintus Catulus onward. Sallust here identifies this genre as annales, history organized by the series of annual magistrates, and his particular starting point is 78 BC, the year of the 2 eponymous consuls. Such history is theoretically without fixed stopping point. As Rome continues, so may the record of its achievements. The sentence also here indicates Sallust's general subject matter, Roman history, res populi Romani gestas, and its specific content, military and political affairs. The juxtaposed populus Romanus and consuls, together enclosed by the hyperbaton, dislocated word order of res gestas, iconically inscribes 2 essential components of Roman history, people and leaders, within the dynamic purpose of the state. And that last word, composui, I have composed, I have arranged, describes the writer's activity as one of organization and artistic structure, appropriately capping the verbal architecture of the rest of the sentence. Finally, one late antique scholar who cites the line uses it to illustrate metrical shapes in prose. Res populi Romani is the first hemistick of a hexameter, that is the first, several feet of a line of dactylic hexameter poetry. And Sallust is our earliest extant example of a Latin historian beginning his narrative with a nod toward historical epic, a genre acknowledged repeatedly since Herodotus as the precursor of historiography. Sallust went on to discuss his predecessors, including Cato and probably Cicero. He commented both on their quality. Cato, he says, was the most eloquent of the Roman race, while a now unnamed writer, sometimes also thought to be Cato, distorted the truth. And on his own place among them, I and such a great crowd of very learned men, he says. Comparing his own work with that of his predecessors has two primary effects. First, it situates Sallust in the profession, he is by implication himself a learned man, in much the same way as the first sentence establishes the bona fides of the book itself. Secondly, it allows him to challenge either explicitly or implicitly the achievement of the historians who precede him. We do not know how he compared or contrasted his own status with the throng, but when Livy quotes this part of the proem, he does so to suggest, with characteristic disingenuousness, that he himself will stand out despite the numbers of other writers. Tacitus himself also characteristically comes right out and says that previous imperial historiography is bunk. He says this in his Historiae and his Annales. And finally, Sallust claims that he is free from bias. Neque me divorsa pars in civilibus armis movit avero. Nor has the fact that I fought on a different side in the civil wars moved me from the truth. You see, he was a partisan of Julius Caesar. And this is a conventional claim of lacking bias. Livy, for instance, echoes it in his preface: Omnis expers curae quae scribentis animum, et si non flectere avero, silicatum tamen ficere posset. He says that he is free from every concern which, though it cannot move a writer's mind from the truth, can nevertheless worry it. The same theme occurs also in Tacitus's famous remarks in his Historiae. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius were known to me neither on account of any favor nor any injury, and therefore it is my plan to relate a few last things concerning Augustus, sine ira et studio, without anger or favoritism, reasons for which I keep at a distance. He says that in his Annales. In Sallus's words, the detail diversa pars, a diverse part, may have been part of, or a different part, a rival part almost, may have been part of a discussion, parallels to which are found in the Bellum Catilinae and Bellum Jugurthinum of his own previous political involvement. What about personalities in the Historia? We've already talked about how personalities seem to be a kind of fixation for Sallust. It seems to be the lens through which he views history. Well, in his famous discussion of the rules of history, of Historia, Cicero emphasizes the importance of character in any telling or interpretation of the past. You need, he says, to reveal not only what was said or done, but also in what manner, and to explain all the reasons, whether they be of chance or intelligence or impetuousness, and also to give not only the achievements of any famous protagonist, but also his life and character. He says this in his De Oratore 263. And Livy mentions something similar in his preface. Ancient history was not history of the longue durée, but of the individual actors, okay? Usually members of the ruling elite of or their antagonists, whose deeds formed a linked chain of achievements that sustained and propelled the state forward. Indeed, as time progressed, military and political history moved closer to biography, as power in those areas was increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, and eventually a single man. Both the monographs and the fragments of the Historia indicate that Sallust shared this interest in character as a moral and a political phenomenon, which above all provides a means of explaining historical events. Following the ancients' lead, one dominant school of modern Roman history, I might just add, is dedicated to prosopography, the study of political and military careers. And indeed, actually, Sir Ronald Simon, who I've talked about so much tonight, is the preeminent exhibit of that, exemplum of that. Two primary modes of characterization in literature have been identified: the direct, via explicit comments by the author, formal character sketches, and so on, and the indirect, showing character through a person's words or actions, by analogy with their personal habits, and so on. One of the primary vehicles for character assessment in ancient history was the obituary, in which the historian himself evaluates the life and deeds of the dead. According to the elder Seneca in his work the Historiae 6:21, Sallust introduced this device to Latin historiography. No formal obituary notices from the Historiae survive, but the anecdote illustrating the character of Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius uses some of the same techniques. We read, "But Metellus, having returned to further Spain, was beheld with a great feeling of glory on the part of those who came running from all sides. They entertained him in a manner far beyond normal Roman or indeed normal human practice. The house was decked out with tapestries and decorations, and stages were created for actors' display. At the same time, the ground was sprinkled with saffron, and there were other features in the style of a magnificent temple. In addition to that, when he was seated, a statue of Victory, let down by a rope and accompanied by artificial thunder, placed a crown on his head. Then, as he advanced, he was worshipped with incense as if he were a god. He generally wore the toga picta when reclining at table. The courses were very recherché, including not only products of the entire province, but many kinds of birds and animals previously unknown from Mauritania across the seas. With this kind of behavior, Metellus diminished his glory, especially in the estimation of serious and old-fashioned men, who judged these things arrogant, insupportable, and unworthy of Roman imperium." This extraordinary description of the general celebration, in which consumption of rare delicacies previously unknown, metonymically represents his consumption of power, and by extension Roman conquest, and it is followed not by Sallust's own evaluation of the scene, but by his report of the serious and old-fashioned men who condemn Metellus' behavior. Despite the distancing, however, this is a judgment to which Sallust has carefully led the reader, both directly by the historian's own comment, for example, in a manner far beyond normal human or indeed normal Roman or indeed normal human practice, and indirectly by the particular items he chooses to describe, and by his repeated use of words inviting us to consider the nature of Metellus's self-representation, that is, a manner, is in the style of, as if, all of which ask us to think about comparison and standards. Reinforcing these, and indeed dominating the anecdote, are the expressions for scene. The whole scene is cast as a spectacle, both for the internal audiences who run to see Metellus and to evaluate his acts, and for the reader who is invited to share in the viewing by the accumulation of visual details. The spectacular qualities of the anecdote are complex. The house in which Metellus is entertained with such damning luxury is fitted out for a theatrical performance in which Metellus plays himself the part of a god. The Romans both courted and feared this type of display, seeing elaborate histrionic spectacle as a locus of deceit and pretense that could elevate a human beyond his station, which is indeed what happens here. The scene may finally be read as a parody of a triumphal celebration, the ultimate Roman display, in which the old men, who also play the part of the historian evaluating Metellus' conduct, take over the role of the slave, who is meant to remind the triumphator of his mortality with the famous phrase, memento mori. Equally typical of the direct method is the epigram, memorable and incisive, distilling the essentials of a character. Here, style became a particularly important vehicle for conveying meaning, as can be clearly seen in Tacitus, whose paradoxical language reinforces a view of the world in general, and of Roman leaders in particular, as unexpected, even monstrous. The technique is not original with Tacitus. He draws on a tradition refined by Sallust and continued by Livy, Velleius Paterculus. In the case of the Historiae of Sallust, the fact that these bon mots have been removed from their original context exaggerates their apothegmatic nature. Bearing that in mind, however, we can still see in them important elements of the historian's narrative technique. Two particularly characteristic epigrammatic forms are found in the fragments. First, the use of what has been called the loaded alternative, a syntactical structure in which the historian offers two or more explanations for an action, refusing to choose between them, but often indicating via emphasis, word order, and so on, what he appears to think most probable. The responsibility for evaluating the truth devolves, therefore, on the reader. The writer, on the other hand, having presented more than one possible alternative, preserves an air of an even-handedness and intellectual rigor. In its effect, the technique is not unlike the oratorical device known as praeteritio, or passing by, or occultatio, of hiding, which ancient rhetorical handbooks recognized as particularly damaging, as for instance in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, Book 4, Chapter 37, quote, "This figure is useful if employed in a matter which it is not pertinent to call specifically to the attention of others, because there is advantage in making only an indirect reference to it, or because the direct reference could be tedious or undignified, or cannot be made clear or easily refuted." So praeteritio is basically when you say, I'm not going to talk about how my opponent here is, a tax fraud or beats his wife or something. I'm not going to talk about that. That would be beneath me to bring all that up. But by virtue of the fact that you're not talking about it, you're saying that you're not going to talk about it, you have talked about it. Though Tacitus refined the loaded alternative, its use far antedates him. Julius Caesar, in his work on the Civil War, he shows a characteristic choice between a flattering and a pejorative reason for doing something, while Clodius Quadragarius, who we've talked about before, offers alternatives comprising human reasons, negligence or avarice, and on the one hand, and a supernatural one on the other hand, the fate bringing disaster on the Roman people for why a certain event happened. In the Historiae of Sallust, Sallust tells us that the notorious Verres, who was also one of these extortionate proconsuls of a province, why he was, quote, under suspicion of having formed an alliance for booty with the bandits, though it was uncertain whether he had truly done so, or whether he only seemed to have done so through carelessness. Neither alternative is flattering, though negligence is less culpable than treason, but either way, Verres is damned not by Sallust, but by report. One can compare the use of the word veteres, the elders, the old people, in judging Metellus Pius that we see on the screen that we've already read. A second and related form of epigram is the one-liner. This may take many syntactical shapes, though comparative expressions and nisi clauses dominate, that is, unless clauses. Its sting depends on its use of the unexpected, and often, like the loaded alternative, it depends on its offering an invidious choice. One finds the coyly nasty remark, for instance, on Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, "Per incertum stolidior an vanior." It was entirely uncertain whether he was more churlish or more unreliable. The invitation to draw an unflattering distinction between near synonyms also is read on the character of Marcus Lollius Palicanus, "Loquax magus quam facundus." He was verbose rather than eloquent. And most characteristically, there is an apparent complement suddenly withdrawn uh, that describes Pompey as modestus ad alia omnia, nisi ad dominationem. Pompey was moderate in all things, except for his thirst for power. The second major type of characterization, the indirect, needs a larger context than either the epigram or anecdote, and is therefore harder to identify in a fragmentary text. Outside the speeches, however, there are some hints of how Sallust may have worked. Sertorius, a popular hero, proudly bore his war wounds as proof of the valor that won him glory. This is a kind of characterization by analogy in which a person's clothes, surroundings, and so on provide clues to their character. Moreover, a man whom Sallust apparently admired, Sertorius, sought a, quote, reputation for justice and virtue in the midst of civil war, end quote. And this is a remark which, when set in the larger context provided by Plutarch's life, seems to be intended positively, but which points nevertheless with epigrammatic surprise to an inherent contradiction in the way the world was working at the time, and therefore in the way we have to read the characters of the actors in that world. And finally, the man whom some have seen as the hero and some the anti-hero of the Historiae, Pompey the Great, showed skill and strength as a youth. Quote, he competed in jumping with the agile, in running with the swift, in the crowbar with the strong. And these are skills that not infrequently accompany the kind of popular, charismatic leader's character that we see also in Hannibal, Catiline, and Jugurtha. Remember, Sallust in the Bellum Jugurthinum chapter 6 says Jugurtha would, quote, ride and throw the javelin and compete in running with his peers. So if Sallust did not go on to comment explicitly on Pompey's character, his use of the convention on its own could have suggested a latent danger in the young man. Similarly, Pompey's youthful belief that he could rival Alexander the Great spoke volumes. But the plainest way of characterizing people is through the words that a writer puts in their mouths. And here the fragments are, if anything, disproportionately rich. Speeches in historiography served a multiplicity of narrative and thematic needs, from introducing variety to creating dramatic effect, in the literal sense by bringing historical actors to life, to offering a historian different voices with which to explore complex political and social issues. The speeches in Thucydides and Cassius Dio on the Greek side and in Sallust on the Latin side of things are perhaps the most famous instances of the use of composed orations as a means of extended political analysis. Moreover, these speeches can and often do explore issues of contemporary as well as historical relevance. So the orations of Lepidus and Philippus, for example, in Book 1 of the Histories, examine from either side of the coin the relative merits of popular and oligarchical government, the status and sincerity of political slogans, and the dangerous question of civil war. All fresh, painful questions to Sallust's readers. Not only do the orations and letters function as a kind of editorial page, but their rhetorical personae deepen our picture of each speaker, both as a type and as an individual. For example, Licinius Macer, the plebeian tribune and annalist, speaks like a popularis historian, citing many past precedents of the plebs' successful opposition to the patriciate and of the Senate's oppressive methods, as he exhorts the people to demand full restitution of tribunician rights. In the letter of Mithridates to the king of Parthia, perhaps the most famous of all these excerpts, there speaks the voice of those in the path of Roman conquest, denouncing Roman greed and imperialism in terms that would set a precedent for the later words of the Samnite Herennius Pontus in Livy, Book 9, Chapter 1, and the Caledonian Calgacus in Tacitus's work Agricola, chapters 30 through 32. Finally, in its fearless, even threatening address to the Senate, Pompey's letter captures his ambition, talent, and self-importance. His conclusion sums it up. quod ego vos moneo, quaesoque ut animad vortatis neo cogatis necessitatibus privatum mihi consulere reliqui vos estis, qui nisi subvenitis invito et praedicente me exercitus hinc et cum eo omne bellum Hispaniae in Italiam transgredientor. I strongly advise and request that you take thought for this matter, and do not force me privately to consider my own deeds. You are our last hope. Unless you help us, though I am unwilling and have already warned you, my army will cross into Italy, and with it will come the whole Spanish War. The combination of aggression and pleading in Moneo quaesoque, I admonish and I demand, introduces the equally well-chosen cogatus that you think, with which Pompey neatly subverts the real power relations of the situation, claiming that any drastic action he might take will be forced on him, a theme that returns in the last sentence, invito et praedicente me, that is, I am unwilling and, as I'm saying this. Privately is an especially dangerous word in this context, and echoing as it does the self-justifications of and accusations against late Republican strongmen who marshaled private armies with private funds. But Pompey's power is felt most keenly in his warning that failure to help his army will bring war into Italy. His surface meaning is that when he is forced to bring his men home to feed off Italian land, Sertorius's rebels will chase them over the Alps, an unrealistic claim, but one which would strike fear into a Senate who had earlier in this same letter been reminded of Hannibal's invasion of Italy, also from Spain. So underneath it all is the threat that Pompey himself can invade Italy as Hannibal did, and will, if the Senate refuses to help, do so. Though the means by which the individual voices are articulated differ, these long excerpts do share certain features, two of which are of particular interest. First, each speaker uses a calculated blend of irony and flattery to insult his opponents and win his audience's support, carefully negotiating a stance of authority and trustworthiness. So Lepidus, for example, adopts a tentative and sympathetic tone to address the populace, repeatedly returning to the word tutus, safe, to assure them that he understands their fears, which he claims are matched by his own anxieties about the Republic, establishing his authority as that of the statesman who can see clearly the good qualities of the plebs and the bad ones of Sulla's followers, the powerful pauci or few. Lepidus first assures his listeners that he understands their reluctance to resort to violence, but his sympathy turns to exhortation as he points out that the tyrant Sulla, too, wants to be tutus, and can be so only by enslaving the populace. Since the oppressor can better safeguard his own than can the oppressed, the plebs must act now or never. Lepidus constructs the present as a time of extremes, in which the people's fear must be turned outward in order to recover the safety and the freedom of which they have been robbed. He says, in these times one must be slave or master. One must fear or cause others to fear. Virites, fellow citizens. Speaking to the Senate, on the other hand, Philippus urges his fellow patres, that is, the senators, to oppose Lepidus's revolutionary plans. His authority comes from two sources. First, his recognition, despite the lure of wishful thinking, of the reality of the present dangers with which he opens his speech. He says, I would most wish, but on the contrary. Secondly, his affiliation with the few, the pauci, who had been who had seen the threat from Lepidus all along. Having thus established his right to speak, he taunts the Senate with their metus, their fear, reminding them of Lepidus's violent measures and urging them to go on the attack to recover their liberty. In effect, his points are precisely the same as Lepidus's. It is his handling of his audience that is different, especially his treatment of their anxiety, where Lepidus treads gently, associating his own fear with the plebs' and working to encourage them to act despite their worries. Philippus attacks the Senate for cowardice, for trying to remain tutus, where only boldness will help them. In conclusion, both speakers offer two options. The first, patently unacceptable. If you call Sulla's acts freedom, then stay as you are. If you like revolution, go along with the traitors. The second is a call to defend their liberty. Rouse yourselves, Quirites, and with the good help of the gods, follow the consul Marcus Aemilius in recovering your liberty. But if liberty and the truth please you more, pass decrees worthy of the name of Senate, and strengthen the brave spirit of your defenders. But while Lepidus ends with a call to follow him, Philippus appends a final paragraph couched in normal curial language, asking for due process in the passing of a senatus consultum ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, basically a decree of martial law. This responsion between the two orations in Book 1 illustrates the second important feature shared by these passages. Despite the lack of a narrative matrix in which to place these orations and epistles, it seems clear that there were complex links among them, complex links of theme, and in some cases of language. Like Lepidus and Philippus, Licinius explores the concepts of tutum and metus. Likewise, though their words are not in formal responsion, the impetuous young Pompey's letter in some ways answers the aged consul Cotta. This is a technique that is better visible in the Bellum Jugurthinum, in which two populares, Memmius and Marius, give orations that, though independent, as we mentioned before, nevertheless respond closely to each other. And the technique is taken up by later historians, especially Livy. For instance, the speeches of Canuleius in Book 4 and chapters 3 through 5, and Appius Claudius Crassus in Book 6, 40 through 41. These are meant to be read as a pair, as are Claudius's speech and his own earlier exhortation, which opens Book 5. What about ethnography? Ronald Syme refers to the variety, instruction, and delight that Sallust took in his ethnography in the Historiae. And it is not only Romans whom Sallust is interested in the Historiae. Since Herodotus, as we've seen, ancient history had accommodated the separate but closely related genre of ethnography, that is, the study of foreign peoples. Herodotean excursions on the Persians, Egyptians, and Scythians provide what Francois Hartog called famously the mirror of Herodotus, the mirror in which concepts of Greekness were reflected and analyzed. The technique, as well as the fascination with other peoples, for that matter, derives ultimately from Homer's Odyssey, which has many, in some ways kind of like the great travel story. Cato incorporated Italian ethnography and geography into his Origines, which were in part an exploration of the founding of different Italian city-states, while in his monographs, Sallust made Rome itself the object of the ethnographer's gaze. While it is impossible now to evaluate the effect of the digressions on the narrative pace and structure of the Historiae, we can get a glimpse of Sallust's treatment of other worlds, especially Sardinia and Corsica, the Black Sea, and southern Italy and Sicily. The fragments show an interest in the shape of the country described, its mythological background, and the origin and names of its inhabitants. In most cases, the scholarly, often recondite information that he puts in there is linked to something easily understandable. So the shapes of Sardinia and Pontus are illustrated with reference to objects on a familiar scale, a human foot and a Scythian bow, respectively, in those cases. When describing Pontus, Sallust does so as any traveler might, his systematic progress along the coast, making the whole description moving it from being strange to more accessible. Similar is his tracing of the mythology attaching to these places. Figures such as Achilles, Jason and Medea, the Amazons, Daedalus, Hercules, and Scylla and Charybdis come into the discussion either as long-distant founding figures whose stories lie behind the historical period, or as myths that can now be domesticated with a scientific explanation. Finally, in discussing the inhabitants of these places, Sallust seems to have concentrated on their movements, especially in their founding migrations and their names. Here, the historian's impulse to familiarize the unfamiliar manifests itself as an interest in etymology and translation. The Bellarii were runaways, because the Latin word bellare means fugitives. In the local language, we're told. The Euxine Sea is nicknamed the unfriendly sea, inhospitale, translating the Greek word oxenos, as opposed to the euxenos, Euxine. In each of these areas, then, Sallust uses ethnography as a way of introducing the rest of the world to Rome. But ethnography serves another purpose as well. As Roman roads codified the routes of expansion and facilitated further conquest, so these geographical studies make textual inroads into into non-familiar foreign territories, accompanying Roman invasion, a technique familiar from other historians and probably beginning with Herodotus, whose ethnographies are situated for the most part at the point at which the invading forces reach a new country. Conventional ethnography and ethnographical features like rivers and climate could serve the purposes of a tale of military conquest as well, coming into the story when they are relevant for the topography of a campaign. The interaction of narrative and narrated, of discourse and story, is especially crucial in a tale of empire. As scholars have recently stressed, by telling the story of conquest, an epic or historical narrative reinforces the extension and legitimation of temporal power. Cicero clearly recognized this, as witnessed by his argument for the diffusion of poetry about Roman res gestae. He said, quote, "If our deeds are limited only by the regions of the world, we ought to desire that where our weapons penetrate, there our glory and our fame reach also, both because they are ennobling to those people whose history is being written, and because certainly for those who are fighting to the death for glory's sake, this is the greatest encouragement for them to endure dangers and toils." It is possible that Sallust's ethnographies served a similar function, incorporating the strange into Rome's empire as Roman soldiers expanded its physical domain. In conclusion, then, foreign lands could also provide an escape, as they nearly do for the rebel Sertorius, in whose story Sallust evokes the mythical Isles of the Blessed, including a reference to the human urge to see unknown things. More humanae cupidinis ignara vicendi. The same urge that Metellus indulged at the dinner table, though there inappropriately. Their very strangeness was intrinsically appealing, and therefore the sighting of the bizarre, such as the Scythians and their wagons, or the fiercest natives in a region, or the poisonous plant that resembled balm, all of which Sallust talks about. This plant whose victims die with a grimace that looks like a smile. All of these strange things. Sallust's ethnography may have been kind of like a lens held up to Rome, showing them both the strange in the light of the familiar and the strange on its own, either as a place of refuge or simply as a source of miracula. Thank you.